to participate in decisions that affect their lives. So we built the Engagement HQ platform all the way back in 2007 to give a voice to those who don't have one, and at the same time produce meaningful and measurable engagement outcomes for your organization. So the phone number you saw at the start and that you see at the bottom right now is actually tied to our platform. It's just one of the many ways that we kind of have in our toolbox to make it as easy as possible for residents to engage. So keep an eye out for an upcoming webinar after this session. We're going to distill some of the feedback that you shared with us today, compile some success stories from our platform and online community engagement in the Triangle area, and share back some of the best practices for meaningful and equitable community engagement. So if you are listening to this and your city, your county, your organization wants to take community engagement to the next level, please feel free to reach out to me. I am on all of the socials. You can find Bang the Table on all the socials. You can also check out our website, bangthetable.com. Don't be a stranger. I will also be hanging around for the whole session. That being said, appreciate your time, and it's my privilege to introduce the panelists today. So Elena, if you could please, thank you. So first, Ratana Sengsulijan is a senior planner with the city of Minneapolis. He developed and led community engagement for the Minneapolis 2040, the city's update to their comprehensive plan. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Urban Studies from the University of Minnesota. And for those of you who don't have a background in planning, you really need to know from the outset here that Minneapolis 2040 made national news for how ambitious it was. And if I can offer my own opinion, how courageous it was. The most talked about outcome was eliminating all single family zoning in the city, both combating the housing shortage and also reversing some of the racial segregation and inequalities that even if you are looking at it today, draw a straight line back to exclusionary zoning tactics that were designed specifically to discriminate by race. So with this project being so big and being the blueprint for future development in the city, meaningful community engagement is right at the forefront of that. So Ratana is going to talk about Minneapolis 2040, the robust community engagement efforts that they undertook to ensure everyone had a voice in the decision-making process. Our other panelist is Sherry Davis, who's going to be speaking about participatory budgeting. So Sherry has a TED Talk that just released back in August, so everyone should check it all out. And one of the quotes that stood out to me was, "We've got to open the doors to city halls and schools so wide that people can't help but walk in." So Sherry's work in participatory budgeting does just that, brings in community and government together to ideate, develop concrete proposals, and vote on projects that solve real problems in the community. So Sherry Davis is the executive director of the Participatory Budgeting Project. She joined PBP staff after nearly 15 years of service and leadership in local government. As director of youth engagement and employment for the city of Boston, she launched Youth Lead the Change, the first youth participatory budgeting process in the US, which won the US Conference of Mayors City Livability Award. Sherry first got involved in city government in high school, serving as the citywide neighborhood safety coordinator on the Boston Mayor's Youth Council and working at the Mayor's Youth Line. Sherry is a graduate of Boston University's Sargent College for Health and Rehabilitation Sciences and holds a master's degree in anatomy and physiology. So with that, again, I'm Jeremy with Bang the Table. I am gonna hand over the controls to Elena, Sherry, and Ratana. The floor is yours. I'm excited to hear the session today.
Thank you, Jeremy, for those kind words and for that introduction. And good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm going to start by giving some background and context of Minneapolis 2040, and then we'll transition into like the meat of today's discussion, which is going to be about our community engagement process. Next slide, please. Just to give some background and context about comprehensive plans and planning in Minnesota. Comprehensive plans provide long-range land use plans and also is a policy document that guides development for the city. And we are required by Minnesota state statute to update these plans every 10 years. And so it's a regular, exercise that a lot of our communities do in Minnesota. Within the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, we have a regional government called the Metropolitan Council, which provides a regional vision on various topical areas that cities need to guide their plans to be consistent with, which includes topics around housing, transportation, waters, and parks. Next slide, please. And again, Jeremy hit on this a little bit, but prior to our 3-year planning process in 2016, 2 articles in the Atlantic came out. And Minneapolis is often associated with a lot of lists and being on top of or near many lists, which includes having the #1 park system in the country, having a great bike infrastructure and network, and various quality of life indicators. And the left article right here, the Miracle Minneapolis, was getting at all this praise about, hey, Minneapolis has great affordable housing. There's great economic and wealth building opportunities. However, there was a second article that came out called the Minneapolis White Lie that says, hold on, wait a second. Those equitable, it's not equitable specifically for our Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And these experiences of wealth and access to housing are not equitably accessed by our BIPOC communities. And it really painted and highlighted the disparities, these deep, long legacy of disparities which exist within our community. So as staff, as we were undertaking this planning process, we were asking ourselves the question of how do we take a comprehensive planning document and really try to eliminate these disparities within the work that we do as city planners. Next slide, please. So early on in the process, we identified 6 comprehensive plan values and goals, or excuse me, values or essentially lens to really guide the work that we do, which range from equity, growth, sustainability, livability, competitiveness, and good government. And really early on, we heard that racial equity specifically should be at the core of the work that we did from a lot of our community engagement process. And that, hey, we can talk about growth, we can talk about planning for 20 years on out, but if we do not center eliminating and addressing these historical disparities which exist within our institutions and within the tools that create these outcomes, that none of this really matters. So next slide, please. And really those goals help, those values really help conduct some consensus building within our staff, partnering agents, public agencies, and community members in which to evaluate our policy development. And these are just a select few of the 13 goals that were eventually adopted. But really one of the top goals that we had was at the core is eliminating disparities within the work that we do, creating more access to affordable housing and housing that serves the diverse households for our residents, creating access to living wage jobs, and making sure that folks can build wealth, and making sure that we address climate change within the process. Next slide, please. So we're really intentional at the get-go of this planning process to say that, this is going to be a complex 3-year planning process across, 11 or 12 different topical areas. And we need to ensure that at the core of this work that community is represented. And when I say that, what we were trying to say was historically underrepresented communities and folks that have been disenfranchised should be at the core of the work that we do. Beyond our comprehensive planning processes, whether it's like public work projects, budget practices that we do every year. We host open houses and online forums, and we typically see the same residents and community members that show up, which are typically like white residents and people with a lot of privilege and power and are in the know. But folks that have historically been impacted by processes by cities and by, and by other forms of government aren't necessarily being heard, and we want to be center those communities within our process. So we were asking ourselves all these different questions about, who do we need to reach out to? How does the community want to participate? Acknowledging that we are not trying to thrust them this, hefty plan into their lap, but how do we make sure that they're active and able to participate along the way in understanding the different obstacles and barriers to participation, and making sure that we bring in content and issues that the community really wants to work on. So we have to be really flexible with customizing each conversation, and then ensuring that along this 3-year process and after adoption of this plan, that we are showing at each milestone how the community is being represented and heard within each of the decision-making process. Next slide, please. So we developed a civic engagement plan to really provide a blueprint for our engagement process over our 3-year planning process. And I might use civic and community engagement interchangeably, but really to get at that, it's not just about doing outreach, but it's about ensuring that folks are represented and folks can participate throughout the process. And within this plan, we've established goals for the civic engagement process to really help evaluate our methods and strategies, which I'll get into later. Identifying key stakeholders, specifically centering BIPOC voices within the process. And then also listing out all the other communities that we also want to reach, including like youth, people experiencing homelessness, renters, families with young kids, and all sorts of stakeholders, and then making sure that we revisit that list along each critical decision-making point to ensure that they're represented. And if not, we need to, and then to be flexible and fine-tune our engagement to make sure they're able to participate. And then, and then also being really thoughtful about, hey, making sure that we ask the right questions that actually inform a decision-making process. Next slide, please. So with these goals, we've identified some key goals to help define our metrics later on about what does successful engagement look like. We want to make sure that the conversations are about issues that the community cares about and wants to work on. We want to ensure that communities are represented. And in terms of metrics, that can look a lot of different ways, and it's not necessarily about the number of people that show up, but it's about how do we make sure that, the voices and the experiences are represented through the process. And then ensuring that folks have access to information. I think this is really important because I think I've always had this issue where, people come to staff, go out to community with a whole bunch of questions, but there's no context or framing about what the issue is. So you want to make sure that they have all the right information to be able to, share their thoughts and share their input. And then from a transparency standpoint, again, accountability, making sure that you show how within the activity and after the fact that their feedback is being used to inform a decision. And then I think to get at that, we were really thoughtful about, hey, if we were to have an interaction with the community, we want to ensure that, especially communities that have historically been underrepresented, we want to build that trust. And what that looked like is, following up, asking if they have any questions, providing any resources necessary so that they're encouraged to return and come back and participate throughout the process. Next slide, please. And this is just part of our identification of who we thought our key stakeholders are. Again, as I mentioned, there's BIPOC and cultural communities, we have renters, we have seniors, we have people that are experiencing homelessness, and there's like a variety of different barriers that each type of strategy or activity could not possibly reach every single stakeholder. I mean, we can talk about language being a barrier. There's the digital divide. If we we're only doing online engagement. There's folks with different accessibility and barriers to participate. Time commitments. We're beyond work. People have family obligations and other social obligations. And I think to hit at, there's a large trust in government, especially. I'll note, we worked a lot with a lot of refugee and immigrant communities too that came to the United States, and they had really poor relationships with their government, and even today within our community in Minneapolis, where we are continuously having to rebuild that trust within all facets of our work. So how do we ensure that we are intentional to ensure that we reduce as many barriers and create accessible modes for participation? So again, I have a list of questions there, which I won't read, but these are some of the things that we were thinking about for each of these specific stakeholders. Next slide, please. And just to capture everything that was in that plan, we really defined the role of community members and set expectations for when we were returning, because we didn't want to make any promises that we can't keep. And that's part of the trust building process and ensuring that folks continue to participate. We made sure that staff were really flexible. Again, we can't engage on all topical areas within each interaction, but we try to cater each conversation to the unique needs and issues. And then we were really intentional about creating different spaces and activities for different types of participants. Some folks, all they want to do is just learn. So we have spaces for folks to learn. Some people just have 5 or 10 minutes to participate, and all they want to do is provide feedback, and that's fine, creating the space for them. But then some folks say, hey, they really want to talk to city staff. So how do we create spaces for folks to actually have a conversation, to interact? And then just again, making sure that we report back and that transparency. So next slide, please. So kind of getting to the nuts and bolts of everything, how we thought about our methods of engagement were really among these 4 different buckets. One we characterize as large convenings, which are really like open houses, and we start to try to envision like a new way of structuring and creating spaces that gets away at a traditional PowerPoint presentation and a Q&A. The second bucket is around in-person interactions, and this includes like going out to street festivals, and then more focus group conversations with specific stakeholders. The third bucket is around technology, where I'll get a little bit more into. And then creative tools is really about, how do we be more innovative in terms of our strategies and our activities. And I will call out that, early on we were intentional about including local artists within our planning process. So we actually issued an RFP to bring in some artists to really help us think through about how to break down these tough topics that maybe a lot of folks don't really interact with or think with, but then but then synthesize it and produce and present it in a way that's more accessible for community. Next slide, please. So getting into the large open houses, I think this is where we capture probably a majority of community members. And what we try to do was create basically a circus, a circus that, kind of capture people's attention, and then that meet the needs of like various people. I think about families who, might have small kids and they can't come to these events because, they're afraid like they can't keep their kid occupied. I think about, maybe folks that maybe have language barriers, right? And can't really interface with the content and materials. So how do we create places where people can learn, observe, interact with others? And a lot of what we try to do was utilize those artists. We had things such as like having a TV style game show with one of the artists, asking for input and feedback about how they see themselves in year 2040 or 20 years on out. Asking people like, how would your housing needs change? You know, what kind of job would you see yourself in 20 years with like the changing economy in different sectors? And, you know, those types of visionary questions really helped folks who probably aren't planners, who aren't policy wonks, you know, put themselves in their own shoes and still provide meaningful feedback. And I think that's what was really powerful for us, was like, hey, turning open houses on its head and you know, setting a new bar and standard for what an open house could look like, and also budgeting for it, you know. And we had food, we had food trucks, and if there's just something about, you know, breaking bread and eating a meal with someone and being able to talk about these very topical areas. So I think that was really powerful for us, as we you know, draw a lot of folks into the planning process. Next slide, please. So in terms of focus groups, our goals for this was, you know, we think about the communities that that are traditionally underrepresented within this process. You know, BIPOC communities, communities of color, cultural communities, youth, seniors, people that are experiencing homelessness. And we want to ensure that, you know, we want to create an environment, not necessarily create an environment, but meet people where they're at. And part of the goals of having a smaller group conversation was to ensure that we can build trust. And then within the 3-year planning process, to ensure that, hey, there's some accountability on our part as we do policy development, so that we can actually come back to a similar group or a larger group of the same group to ensure that, hey, this is what we heard early on. We're going to come back and report back on what we heard and how we use your feedback, and then still collect more feedback along the way. And I think these were really successful for us, but it required a lot of investment from staff to really build those connections and relationships. Fortunately for us, we have a department called Neighborhood and Community Relations, which have staff liaisons for these different cultural communities that have built this trust and built relationships with different organizations to help bridge those relationships. But I think it's incumbent as us as staff to also, you know, get away from like, hey, we represent the city, but then to actually introduce ourselves and say, hey, I'm Ratana, I work for the city, and, you know, how can I help you? And I think that's the way of like breaking down something cold as like city government, is to like to make this more of a personal interaction. And I think that's where we spend a lot of our time, is to build these relationships and leveraging that social capital to ensure that folks continue to feel encouraged to participate later on in the process. So, I mean, and I think this is something that we're still trying to do to this day, you know, even though our planning process ended back in late 2018, we have to be able to keep this conversation going in different spaces. And that includes, you know, using the relationships that we have built and connecting to other efforts that we're doing, such as, for example, our public works staff is working on a transportation action plan, which is implementing a lot of our transportation policies within Minneapolis 2040. So just to keep those connections going is really important. Next slide, please. In terms of technology and online engagement, what we envision as how we use these tools was to ensure that this is not necessarily the core of our strategy, but how do we use this as an add-on to our main in-person interactions? So whatever we did in person, we made sure to build that stuff online so that folks that may not be able to participate in person, or who probably don't have a lot of time, or who wants to revisit, can go back online and learn more. And I just want to say that, like, this is one of the examples of some of the work that we did early on in the process. And I think it's, in terms of preparing folks to participate, I think we need to what we try to do, and I think we did really well, is provide that context and that history to our work. Specifically, I think Jeremy spoke about some of the housing and land use policies that we proposed, but we as staff did a lot of work to work with various institutions within our community, such as University of Minnesota, and a project called Mapping Prejudice, which mapped racially restrictive covenants within our community and some of the redlining work. And I think that was really powerful, which also validated some of the experiences that the community members have, and I think that's really important where, as we take stories, as we take feedback, we have to be able to honor the time that the community member is spending to participate in this process. And part of that recognition is, as staff at least, is to support that work with a lot of the history and data that we can dig up as to support the policy development within what we do. And a lot of the online stuff is just a replication of what we do in person. And again, to be able for folks to learn or provide feedback if they just have a little limited time. Next slide, please. And throughout every type of activity, I think it's really important that you think about what reporting and documentation looks like. And what that can look like is everything ranging from having a Post-it note where folks can write their comment, but it can also look like, having a note taker for a small focus group conversation to ensure that the conversations and the feedback is being captured and documented. And some of the things that we try to do range from event summaries, which are really tools as staff to really document, the conversations that we had, and actually who was represented. I think it's really important that we show who, folks, I think elected officials might want to count widgets about the number of people and stuff like that. And we try to do that, but I don't think it's necessarily an accurate representation of what we're trying to do. Because for example, is our metrics supposed to be our engagement feedback? Is this supposed to be representative of the population, or is this supposed to be equitable? And I think in terms of equity, it means hey, making sure that we create as many opportunities to make sure that the folks that we intended to reach out to are represented. And and what in terms of reporting, we had summaries that were produced at different milestones within the 3-year planning process. We documented every meeting of the 150 different outreach and engagement events we've conducted over the 3-year planning process. And then we took all the feedback that we collected and actually transcribed all the notes that we had on every sticky note or Post-it note over the 3-year planning process and actually published that all online. And that's what we envision as transparency. And it could look a lot of different ways within various processes and projects, but I think for us, that's what really worked. And I wanted to call out this image at the bottom right of your screen, which was an example of that transparency and accountability. And part of in the last year of our planning process, as we were developing policies, we actually had red-lined edits that we showed the community members and published online about the edits that we made based upon the comments and feedback. Next slide, please. And I'm about to wrap up right here, but in summary, I think some of the recommendations and lessons that I hope that you all took away was, focusing on centering BIPOC voices and experiences in planning processes and the project and policy development. I think that should be in the core of everything that we do as as government, as in the role of dismantling these institutions and systems which create these disparities that we see today. Building relationships with communities ahead of time. Be intentional about your engagement process by building a plan and then investing and budget for engagement, because it takes a lot of resources. So again, thanks for having me here today. I'm going to pass it along to Elena.
Thanks so much, Hannah. So I am going to stop sharing now and pass it over to Sherry Davis, who's going to be our second presenter. As Jeremy mentioned earlier, she's from the Participatory Budgeting Project. I think she's going to speak a little bit more broadly about participatory practices in general. So Sherry, I'm just going to stop, and now you should be able to.
Elena, thank you. And Ratana, what a good presentation. I'm like excited to get to the Q&A because now I have questions about different things. But in the spirit of getting to the Q&A, let me share my screen with y'all. I'm good at a lot of things, but like talking and typing is one of the things that I'm not particularly good at. So bear with me for half a second while I talk through this. And of course, my computer is going to be like really slow while I get all this going. But while that's happening, and just bear with me for a moment as our screen comes up, you might be able to see it. It might be loading now. But direct your attention to the chat and take a moment to like stretch your fingers out a little bit, because I am getting ready to ask you a chat question that's going to direct kind of like how this presentation goes. And you're going to have to put in a response. You can put in whatever you want, but I'm going to ask you to put in a 0, a 1, a 2, or a 3. If you have never heard about participatory budgeting before, can you put a 0 into the chat? If you have heard about participatory budgeting before, but you don't feel like you know a lot about it, can you put a 1 in the chat? If you've heard about PB and you feel like, yeah, I know about that, I know what participatory budgeting is, can you put a 2 in the chat? And if you feel like you could have taught what I'm about to teach, if you feel like you could have ran this session on participatory budgeting, put a 3 in the chat. So again, 0 if you're like, I've never heard about PB before. 1 if you're like, I kind of heard about it, but I don't know a lot about it. 2 if you're like, I definitely know what participatory budgeting is. And 3 if you're like, I could teach a workshop on PB. I want to know where we are, what kind of things folks need, and kind of like how fast I can go. So take a moment and put that in the chat for me. And I see that the chat's going crazy now. Great. So there's all sorts of answers from 2s and 1s. There's like 1.5s. Great. So at the end of this, I'm going to make sure that everybody, hopefully, is at a 2, that you really know what participatory budgeting is. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and retry this one more time because something weird's happening. And Elena, we may have to do the backup with you advancing my slides. If I'm being really honest, this has never happened to me before, but of course, it's what happens today. Good. And as we get going, and I did stop sharing my screen, so if you can, I know you have my slides in front of you. If you can pull them up, that would be wonderful. And I will kindly ask you to help me in advancing them. But as we get going, by way of introduction again, my name is Sherry Davis. And the first thing that I like to tell people when I'm in a group like this is that I am a recovering government employee. I worked in local government for just about 15 years under 2 mayors. And shout out to y'all, the folks that work in government. The work is hard. I imagine you haven't gotten a lot of thank yous lately. I imagine that there's a lot of questions that come in your direction. And in my experience working in government is the folks that work there are community members. These are members of community. And these are folks that really care about taking up the mantle of public service. So shout out to y'all that are doing really important work, especially if you're starting to ask questions about what deep community engagement looks like, what reimagining democracy looks like, and really leveraging the power that you have to really bring that forward. So I just wanted to start off with an I see you and thank you. Now I no longer work in government, but I'm really close to y'all. I'm like committed to supporting folks that are really committed to making change in community. And I do that in my role at the Participatory Budgeting Project by supporting folks that are like, hey, how do we do this stuff? Whether it's participatory budgeting or something else. one of the things that I did was I ran and created some divisions in government. I was that young person that got a summer job and never left. I just kept showing up. Like, I work here now. And eventually they were like, all right, fine, we'll give you a job. And I took that job as a teenager and found my way working up city government until I, one, started running a department, but then two, I created a division. And I didn't know that that kind of wasn't allowed because no one told me. So I was like, well, why don't we just do this? And then folks were like, well, that's not how it works. And I just kept being like, well, why? And we ran out of answers. And I didn't know that it was like not cool to ask why 100 times. I just had no idea. I was 23. I was like, but why? But why? And finally, folks were like, you know what, Sherry, just go ahead and make the division and see how it works. And I said, great. And I was able to create this kind of powerhouse for youth engagement. I put 4,000 young people to work through our employment arm of that division that I created. I oversaw civic engagement initiatives for young people that included the Mayor's Youth Council and the country's first instance of youth-focused participatory budgeting. I'll talk about that in a second. And then the third piece of what we did was we made sure that we had a resource center for youth. All of those things were all spread out across the city beforehand. So just going back to Ratana's presentation about how important it is to put community at the center of shaping things so that they work, I was able to experience that in like real time. I didn't know necessarily at the time that it was happening, but that really set the stage then for what I thought was possible, period, when it came to doing this work in government. So when I got over to the participatory budgeting project a couple years ago, really started thinking about kind of equity and how we take this participatory budgeting work to the next level. Next slide. And so the way that we do this work now is we think about kind of technical assistance. How do we show up for community organizations, organizers, those that work in local government, to really support them in customizing a participatory budgeting process that's going to work for them. No two communities are the same. So no two PB processes are going to be identical. In order to kind of be able to support folks through that, we develop tools and resources to make that implementation easier. And then last but not least, we build networks and communities so that people can answer questions for each other. Next slide. And so before I get into the nuts and bolts of participatory budgeting, I wanted to ground in the definition of participatory democracy very quickly. And I heard that y'all have been talking about this in the last couple Thursdays. But what I'm talking about when I describe participatory democracy is this opportunity for community members to directly participate in decision-making that affects their lives. That's how we understand this term of participatory democracy, deeply connected to decision-making and community. Next slide. If you've seen the ladder of participation before, put a 1 in the chat really quick for me. Help me out. If you've seen this ladder of participation before, ooh, boom, 1s are coming in. So some people have seen it. Great. So I'm not gonna spend a ton of time. Ooh, and y'all know my code, I see a 0. So if you're like, ooh, I'm not sure, I haven't seen that before, that's perfect. So when I talk about civic engagement, community participation, and what the experience of most people in community is, Ratana touched on this. A lot of folks generally only experience government or civic engagement interaction at the bottom of this ladder, which can look like maybe I get a little bit of information, maybe there's like some passive thing that's happening, but I'm not allowed to make a decision, kind of interact with something. Think about a budget hearing when folks show up to deliver public testimony, right? So they're able to like say something, they're able to receive something, but it's pretty unclear about what's going to happen next or if they have an opportunity to shape that conversation. As we move up the ladder, we see folks that are able to maybe engage in a deep community process where they're able to consult, they're able to offer recommendations. And oftentimes what we see in government is that is great. We're able to collect some really good information from those discussions, but there's no commitment to that single parent that showed up and participated, that what they said and believed in is going to be a part of the decision-making structure. It could be, or it may not be. And so as we move up that ladder of participation and we think about boards, councils, deep engagement processes like participatory budgeting, that's where we're really starting to see some community control, some citizen power, some decision making that reflects that principle of participatory democracy. Next slide. And so, in the spirit of time, shout out to some of the folks that do some deep work with us as we think about equity in participatory budgeting, and as we think about building and developing tools that are going to work in community. That includes some amazing folks like the Movement for Black Lives, BYP 100, Policy Link, Public Agenda, and a bunch of others. Next slide. Shout out to Elena, beautiful slide advancement. Thank you. All right, so this is a slide I really wanted to get to. So for y'all that are like, participatory budgeting, I kind of know about it, I've heard about it, maybe I saw the TED Talk, maybe I saw this like 4-minute explainer on PB. I'm gonna give you the very quick overview of how it works. I want you to imagine, if you will, that there are 2 more icons on this slide on either end, so you can't see them, but just imagine them in your mind. And when we think about participatory budgeting, there are these 6 phases. And just as a reminder, participatory budgeting is a democratic innovation that started in Porto Alegre, Brazil 30 years ago, but it's 10 years new in the United States. And it's still growing and shaping and changing, right? But it's very customized to this instance. And so the first phase of PB that's not on this slide is actually the design phase. And like Ratana said, it's really important to make sure that you're designing with community and not for community. So when we think about the design phase, we actually think about community coming together to write a rule book that makes clear what the elements of the process are, makes them very transparent. There are some decisions made at the very beginning about who's eligible to participate in the process, what the goals of the process are, how we define equity in this particular process. That is the writing the rules or design phase. So who shows up to be the steering committee? I mentioned I ran the first youth process in Boston, where we saw 12 to 25-year-olds decide on $1 million of the city's capital budget. The steering committee for that process was 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds, high school students. We had individuals as young as 12, 13, and 14, and not many over the age of 21. And that was very intentional. And not only did they show up, but they showed up in partnership with one other person that was in community or organization with them, and an adult that supported them, made sure that they knew how to get there and that they knew how to get home afterwards. So we were very intentional about making sure that we had a steering committee that represented the communities that we talked about when we were thinking about equity. And I will say, for those of y'all that are nervous about 16 and 17-year-olds making decisions about budgets, they make really good decisions, like really smart decisions. So that's really important. So after the design phase and the rules are written that govern the PB process, we move into the idea collection phase. This is where we meet folks where they are and collect ideas in person, via text message, and the question and the prompts change. What feels safe in your community? What would you invest in to grow that safety? What do you love about your community? What in your community makes you uncomfortable? And they may move through a series of prompts that allows us to collect ideas in the form of large events, in the form of text messaging, in the form of having a quick conversation at a public transit stop. The steering committee that represents community really kind of thinks about where engagement needs to happen, what that design of it should look like. And that's how we make sure that we roll that out in the idea collection phase. It's not me that decides what community needs. It's community that decides what the best design for them is. After we collect ideas, hundreds, if not thousands of ideas on how to spend a portion of funds, we develop them into concrete proposals. That's the proposal development phase. And unlike some other research phases where you might end up with a 45-page report on something, PB is a bit different. This is where folks that are in community and maybe folks that work in a city agency like Public Works may work together to talk about what's feasible, how a particular project may work, put a cost estimate on it, and make a very simple description of what this means so that folks know what it is. That project becomes fully vetted by the budget delegates, the community volunteers that help to vet those, and the folks that work in city government. Once that project is finally vetted, it goes onto a ballot. That ballot goes out into community, it meets people where they are, and unlike a local or national election, a PB vote usually is open for a week, maybe two, and it incorporates elements of online and in-person engagement. We're really reducing barriers for participation. So we're not seeing things like only citizens can participate. We're seeing folks that are formerly and currently incarcerated engage in participatory budgeting votes. We're seeing individuals that are below the age of 18 engage in PB votes. We're seeing folks that are part of immigrant and refugee communities participate in PB votes. And I think, again, going back to equity and centering folks that are traditionally and historically excluded, this is a really important element of participatory budgeting. And then the last phase, so winning projects are implemented, there's an announcement to community. And sometimes, as you all know, capital projects take time. So community is able to be a part of the implementation with that and learn about, well, what's going to happen next and so on. The process is evaluated. That's the last piece that you can't see, the other icon. The process is evaluated at the end. And that's because budgets need to be living, breathing, moral documents, right? And so this participatory budgeting process has to be a living, breathing process with community that gets evaluated on a regular basis. When an agency, an institution, an organization adopts participatory budgeting, they mark a change in the way that they do business. And so that means that we have to regularly evaluate, customize, so that we can move forward with those learnings that center community. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned, participatory budgeting has happened all over the world, and our focus is in North America specifically. This slide now is a bit out of date, but you can get a picture of how much money, and we're talking about now over $300 million that community has directly decided on through participatory budgeting processes in some way across the country. Slide. And so I'm going to move through a couple slides pretty quickly, but I will just name, I wanted to bring forward a couple of really interesting case studies for you. And so there's some really good participatory budgeting kind of in this region that you all are in, but I wanted to name that there are some examples like what happens in Hartford, Connecticut, that really has an opportunity to center equity because they're bringing this into facilities with individuals that are currently incarcerated and formerly incarcerated. And what I really like about this particular process is the impact that it's having on recidivism. So when folks are coming back into community, they're really feeling a part of ownership, a part of welcome, a part of deep engagement, and they want to kind of be a part of the investments that are happening in that space. And so I think it's a really good process to lift up for folks that are interested in understanding the intersections of participatory budgeting and justice specifically. Next slide. At this moment in time, there's a lot of conversations about PB and divest invest. So how do we really think about maybe systems that are happening or elements of public safety that are happening in community that are proving to be less safe? How do we really interrogate what those are? How do we put community at the center of determining what safety means to them and then invest in those things so that they work and are community driven? And so participatory budgeting has really been identified as a tool that folks in government can use as part of the invest element of the divest invest conversation. And we've seen that again globally, and there's some really good examples of that come out of Scotland, but we also see this now in the United States. Phoenix Union High School District is a really good example of this. They're going through a process right now of reimagining public safety. Seattle is another example of a community that we're working with right now to really use a participatory budgeting process to reimagine public safety. Slide. Next slide. I'm like, faster, faster. All right, perfect. Next one. One more. Perfect, next one, we're almost there. Keep going, you're advancing the slide so good. Yeah, so this again, another point that I wanted to make very quickly, I mentioned that when we talk about PB, we're talking about kind of removing some barriers for folks so that they can really participate. And I wanted to name like what this ends up meaning on the other side in terms of impact. So very quickly, another case study that I wanted to put on your radar. Vallejo, California, several years ago experienced bankruptcy. So there was some very clear mistrust in government. There was some questionable doubt around like whether or not financial decisions in government were being made like safely, right? And there was a severe breakdown of trust in community. So they went on a multi-million-dollar PB process that allowed community members to kind of reimagine what was possible. And 1 in 5 of the voters was actually ineligible to participate in a local or national election. And they were really able to kind of change not only the relationship between community and government, but really what was being invested in that city so that everyone could thrive together after coming out of bankruptcy. And I think it's a really special example of what the potential is for participatory budgeting that we can all build on. Next slide. Yeah, next one, we're gonna keep going. That's the one I want. So I keep mentioning these impacts in community, and I wanted y'all to know that they were real. So when I did this work in Boston, one of the things that Harvard University did was a study on our Youth Lead the Change process. And young people reported a couple things. One, that they knew more about government, that they were more confident in their own skills, but that they were more likely to engage, period. That they were more likely to run for political office, maybe even themselves, that they were more likely to volunteer for a community-based organization, that they were more likely to step into a government-owned building, period. So for me, as we think and as we all think about civic engagement, participatory budgeting, participatory democracy, this is about putting tools and resources into community members' hands so that we can build amazing teams of folks that really care and understand community. For me as a young person, I didn't know that I was going to have a 15-year career in government. I just cared about what was happening. And someone gave me a chance and told me that I was allowed to be there. Most of my peers never had an opportunity like that. Participatory budgeting changes that. It builds pipelines of leadership to support us all when we're thinking about bettering our communities and seeing young people, leaders in community, build the skill sets to be really successful in the roles that folks like you are in right now. Imagine if you had an opportunity to engage with participatory budgeting or participatory democracy when you were 14 years old. Imagine how that would impact the skill sets that you have now, the civic muscle that you have now, and the people around you have. And that's what we're talking about building here. We're going to move through a couple slides and then I'm going to close out. I just want to tell you kind of like what's next and what do we do with all of this. So if you could scroll down in a couple slides, you'll see some mention of democracy beyond elections. And so as I close out, the participatory budgeting project, as we focus on PB and really putting this resource into folks' hands so that they can do it, the question that we get is like, we like participatory budgeting, but how do we build the infrastructure to make this work successfully? Like, where do we start? And so at PBP, absolutely, folks can reach out to us so that we can help you think about where to start. But a month and a half ago, after some deep collaboration with our partners, we launched Democracy Beyond Elections, which is a shared learning platform for folks that are like, hey, I want to commit, and scroll down for me, I want to commit to this principle, and scroll down all the way till you see this principle of participatory democracy that is equitable, there it is, of community-led decision-making that is equitable, accessible, and significant. If you're willing to commit to that principle and you want to learn about tools to be able to build the infrastructure to do that, then great. We're going to get them to you for free. And we'll do one better. We'll train some of the people around you so that you have a democracy team, if you will. When I worked in government, I would have loved for people to train me and a democracy team of folks in community to help me be successful in bringing forward a community initiative. that is what Democracy Beyond Elections creates, this opportunity for that to happen, for us to build some shared learning and to put tools and resources into everyone's hands so that we can really make some change on a local level and maybe even scale it up far beyond that. Next slide. And so as we close out, I just wanted to mention this piece that we're in this partnership phase. We've just kind of launched this campaign so that folks can kind of sign on and commit to this principle so that we can get those resources out and then see really successful examples of PB and participatory democracy more broadly with our partners. I just want to go to the very last slide as I close, and this is it. Next steps. I just wanted to tell y'all that there are a couple ways that you can stay in conversation with us and learn more about participatory budgeting, but also democracy beyond elections. We do every other week a conversation that we call Visions for Justice, and we have 2 scheduled conversations left, and there'll probably be more in the series. The next one is October 14th, and I think that's a really great way to get into conversation with a bunch of folks and experts across the country to really think about, well, how could some of these methodologies be used where I live, where I work? So I wanted to mention that to y'all. And then the second thing I just wanted to say is if you want to stay connected with some opportunities for some deep resources that are built by some of the partners on the ground focused on equity, sign up for DBE. You can go to democracybeyondelections.org, and I'm excited to build that community with folks like y'all. So let me stop there because I think Ratana and I are excited to answer the questions that you have, and I'll pass it back to our moderator.
Great, thank you, Sherry. And hopefully everyone was okay with the crazy scrolling, the world of the virtual meetings. So let's take some time. We've got about 20 minutes for questions, and I know these were both great presentations. So if anyone has a question that they'd like to drop for either Sherry or Ratana into the chat box, now would be the time, and I can help coordinate asking those questions.
I mentioned that I had a question that was real. Do I get to ask it?
Go for it. Get started.
Okay, great. So Ratana, this is a thing that I think about a lot, and that is that civic technology cannot replace in-person engagement, period. And you talked about a beautiful strategy for deep engagement that had some big in-person things as a part of it. And as you move forward and think about kind of the plans and what happens next in our state of COVID, can you talk a little bit about kind of how you're thinking about this? Are you all considering moving forward with in-person engagements with some safety measures? Are you thinking about kind of blending tech to support that? I'm really curious on your take.
Yeah. First off, great presentation, Sherry. Just want to give a shout out there. But yeah, I think we have a new reality here with COVID, and over the past, I'm going to say 7 months since our city staff has been working remotely, we still have a lot of different public projects that we're working on. And a lot of our engagement that still exists has shifted a lot to online formats. So whether we use the platform Microsoft Teams, but similar to Zoom or any online formats. And I think that's been kind of the core of our engagement thus far in today's reality. But I still think it's still missing a lot of that representation of folks that we are speaking about that are mostly impacted by the communities or by the work that we do as a city. So I think hopefully, we can transition to more in-person stuff, but I think we're still grappling with the public health challenges that prevent us from getting into in-person interactions. And yeah, I really prefer that in-person interaction because something about, speaking in front of someone, seeing their body language, seeing just their presence, those small social interactions and social cues speak a lot to beyond just like some, beyond, a virtual engagement like this or via like a text form or something. So I think that's something I hope that we can eventually move forward to, but it'll probably be a while.
Yeah, my opinion on this may be a little controversial, so I'll acknowledge that, and then I will share it. I think that, so one, I think just generally, like, there's no going back to quote normal, right? Like, unless we start to think about advocating and implementing universal broadband, civic tech is going to be like inherently inequitable and inaccessible. I see that thumbs up, girl. I appreciate that. And I think that so there's just this inherent challenge, right? So like I think that we need to like really consider what accessibility looks like and what emphasis on the written word looks like, and how we really think about art integration. And one of the things that I love that Ratana mentioned is that at their public engagement assemblies are graphic recorders, right? And there are ways to bring that in on a Zoom call for sure. But I think that we have to imagine more of what is possible. And I'm not saying that like hand out a bunch of flyers at a grocery store, but I am acknowledging that there are things that are still happening in community, and there is still an opportunity to meet people where they are. And that may not look like the same in-person engagement before, but I think that there's an opportunity to safely engage community to say, how can we have some safe discussion? What can that look like? And it's not going to look like what we did before. It's going to look like what we do tomorrow. And yeah, that's how I'm thinking about that.
That's great. So we have a ton of questions. So let's try and get through as many as we can. And then if we run out of time, we can find a way to answer some of those questions after the session as well. So the first question, this is specifically for Sherry. How does PB avoid having people only voting for projects that would benefit them personally?
Yeah, and Ratana, answer this too, I'm sure that you have opinions, but the way that we avoid this is when we think about doing PB, we really ask folks to think outside of themselves, right? And that discussion part that I talked about before really allows people to move and change. Just a quick example. I did some PB work in New York City. I was sitting in a community forum for idea collection. In walks a really nice person, and they say, I want a cat park in my community, an outdoor place where my cats can like play with other cats. And there were folks in that meeting that were like, my child's school doesn't have bathroom doors. The person that came in talking about a cat park was like, oh, I didn't know that. You know what? Maybe we don't need a cat park right now, and we should like focus on your kid really, like that's important. And so that came through workshopping and conversation though, right? So that's a big piece of this. The other thing that I would say quickly is we ground with accessible data. And so we look at tools like data to the people on our website, open source information about where dollars are spent and what is happening in community, so that folks can understand what that looks like and really step outside of themselves and think about this frame of equity. And that's where I would just mention that words matter. And having shared understanding around group agreements and consent, like Ratana mentioned before, is really important in how we move through this conversation. Ratana, do you want to add anything really quick?
I would just ask, there's always data and information you can collect. And I think just be really intentional and thoughtful about, for example, like a survey or democracy, what's the intent and purpose of that, and how would you use that? That's just my question. I don't really have anything to add beyond that, but just be really intentional about whatever you collect. How would you use it?
Yeah, dotmocracy is really important. And if you don't understand what dotmocracy is, it's when everyone gets a couple of sticky dots and then they're able to kind of cast their vote on like sometimes a ballot in the room or virtually, and then you're able to collect that and make some decisions about consent from what happened. And we affectionately refer to that as this really important tool called dotmocracy.
I think probably a lot of us have seen that in practice. So another question that is coming in from Aaron This might be part of DBE and the conversations around policing, but could you talk a bit more about ways to involve residents in the entire budget process and not just PB?
Oh my gosh, yes. Okay, so I gave a presentation to the Government Finance Officers Association, and I did not say this, but I will say this to y'all. So generally speaking, just as a reminder, budgets work like this, right? A small group of people or a person creates a budget, and then like another small group of people or a person reviews that budget, and they make sure, or they vote down, usually they remove elements from it, and then it's passed, and that kind of like is the prediction of all of the expenses for a fiscal year, right? So everyone kind of knows this generally, and you can debate me on this if you like. And the way that I think we engage everyone in the overall budget, and I appreciate this question because participatory budgeting is about identifying a line item in the budget or a space, it doesn't have to be a line item, a space in the budget where we can make decisions together. It's not about creating a new line. It's about saying we should make decisions together about this because it's important. Now, engaging folks in the overall budget process, that like 2 sentences that I said about how the budget works generally, whatever those 2 sentences for you are, people need to know that. Like budgets are not that mysterious. So like, I think that's the first thing that has to happen. The second thing that I think is paramount and important in engaging folks in the overall budget process is if you have, we'll just talk about fiscal year that begins in July, because that's just how it works in my brain, right? So let's just talk about fiscal year that begins in July. The budget is usually due somewhere around like spring, April, right? So advocacy for budget things has to happen in the fall. It has to happen way before that. And so that's how you engage people in the budget. You need to tell them when the timelines are, where to show up, and who the players are to talk to. The beautiful thing about PB is it creates infrastructure for that conversation. So if you go through a PB process one year, the next year, you're like, okay, I see how this works, and I know where to show up, and I want to, and I'm welcome, and I have some relationships.
Awesome.
That's my opinion.
Perfect. This is a question for both of you. Can you share strategies for trust and relationship building? So Carrie is the one who asked the question. She likes the idea of transparency, documentation, and reporting back, but how do you begin the conversation?
Maybe I'll just start with, I mean, again, it's to frame it in the relationships that already exist today and to date, right? For all these different stakeholders. You know, I'll speak specifically to a community that I'm really close with, and you know what I identify. So I'm Lao, you know, and we have a community that came from Southeast Asia as refugees after the Vietnam War, and there's this pre-existing context already about the relationship of community and government already, and there's this like lack of distrust, feeling like you can't participate or feeling like you can't have a voice within processes, or feeling like things are already decided, so what's the whole point of speaking up? So using that framing and understanding, that's where you kind of work about strategy and how to build trust, and then asking the question to that community is like, you know, how do you want to engage and how do you want to participate on this project? And we were really intentional with those focus group conversations. Like we asked the questions of like, hey, what are the issues you want to work on, you know? And we heard specifically like housing is a big issue I want to work on, and you know, access to parks and different amenities. So what that looked like from a trust building perspective was, you know, we brought back staff and directors who had the power and influence working on those topical issues and brought them to future conversations. That's what it looked like from trust building. And then they said, hey, we really think this is the most accessible way for us to participate. We feel comfortable in this. You should continue to return to us in subsequent engagement phases. And it's all about asking that question, like, what do you want and what do you want to see, and then following through on what you promise. And I think that's part of the trust building. But I think the practices of like accountability and transparency through that documentation is also important.
Yeah, I would just my response is summed up in a couple of words. So trust building, it looks like vulnerability, acknowledgement, and action. And I would apply that in your personal relationships as well as in your community relationships. I think oftentimes there's like this extractive mentality. We're asking a lot of community. We're asking folks to like show up and bare their soul in a community meeting. Maybe even like retouch some trauma that they've experienced. And then what? We pack up the Post-its and we walk out the room, right? That doesn't feel good. And so being able to create spaces where we are stepping in our capacity as in government as vulnerable, and we are acknowledging historically and presently what is happening, and then we're able to move into action, that's real trust.
Yeah, that's great. A lot of different questions coming in, but we'll keep going in order and hopefully we can get through them all. What kind of metrics do you use to show that you met your objectives with your processes?
So we have a North American research board that put together about 13 different metrics, and so we center around those. But we also use models like participatory action research. Check out the work like Take Root Justice. Public Agenda and Policy Link are examples of organizations that are part of our research board. So we use metrics like that. They're qualitative and quantitative. So it's both the stories and the numbers. Ratana?
In terms of our final metrics, we eventually landed on, counting the number of events that we've attended or hosted. We try to represent stakeholders that we intentionally try to reach out to, and then also the geographic distribution of our events. Just to kind of go back to how we structure them. For example, large open houses, we try to structure it in communities that maybe are are transit dependent, and maybe have some accessibility issues. So we try to ensure that we're hosting in facilities that were in proximate to public transit. Or for example, we also make sure to attend specific events that maybe had a large representation of our stakeholder groups, such as, for example, going out to Juneteenth every year to reach out to our African American community members. So I think, we can't come down to counting the number of people at each of those smaller events, but at least for the larger events, we try to keep track of the number of participants from there. But again, it kind of goes back to how you identify as what success looks like. And for us, part of that success, which is more qualitative, is ensuring that there's equitable representation of the stakeholders that are going to be mostly impacted by our work.
Awesome. Ratana, this is a follow-up question for you. So you talked about the plan, you have to do it every 10 years, your plan. Did you have any chance to compare representation from the most recent plan with the one previously done a decade earlier?
And is that comparing to the actual plan or the engagement process? The representation?
Plans engagement.
Planned engagement. So I would just say that, I wasn't around for the last update 10 years ago. But what it was clear was like there wasn't the same amount of documentation in terms of the engagement process. So I think this is a new standard that we've set within our comp planning process, and hopefully we can raise that standard 10 years from now when we update our engagement, when we conduct our next engagement process for the next comp plan.
Awesome. This is a question from Stephanie. How do you build capacity or momentum towards centering work and collaboration around equity?
I answered in the chat, and I'll just summarize quickly. I'm like, facilitator training, implicit bias training, all of these things are needed for capacity. You don't just like show up knowing all of this stuff. So it has to happen. But I think the biggest point, going back to vulnerability, acknowledgement, and action, is that the work has to be done, and it literally has to be invested in. So one of the things that I had to do in government often was be like, hey, we need this. Or I had to leverage some relationships that I had with folks, grassroots leaders, and folks are really nervous to turn to potential community partners and say, hey, you have this whole body of work. Can you train us so that we have some shared language? That really needs to happen.
Awesome. We have a question from Jeremy, who acknowledges that Sherry is right, saying that sometimes in-person engagement can't be replaced. His question is, what's your favorite youth PB idea from Boston?
Well, some of them were like Wi-Fi access points, right? So just going back to universal broadband, young people are very, very smart, right? Because they were like, in order for us to be successful, live, thrive, work, play in Boston, like we need to like know what our homework is and be able to do all of the things that we need to do, especially in communities that have limited access, period. So that was one of my favorite projects. Another one was they said, look, like young people need to access information. And like, why don't we have an opportunity to have like an app, like a mobile app that would tell us jobs, things, free things to do, all of these things. Like, why doesn't that exist? So that was another one of like my favorite projects. Okay, one more. This one is connected to the last one. They said we need to install television screens in all of the schools that share important information about what we need to know on a regular basis, because we're not getting information about what we need to know. So we need to make sure it's accessible to everyone. So if you stand in front of the screen for 90 seconds, you'll know what you need to know. So that's another example of a really cool project.
Those are awesome. Young people are very smart. From Mark, in your community engagement efforts, have you considered differentiating between interested stakeholders and citizens? And he mentions this question because a recurring challenge is a substantial portion of the most vocal participants that vocally advocate for town making investments, but would not pay taxes in support of constructing or operating the facility investment due to not living in the town.
Yeah, I think there are some models you have to look at, like places like Cambridge that don't use language like investment. They use language like live, work, and play. Right? So it's a broader definition. I think it goes back to the goals of the process, right? And so if the goal of the process is to center the people that like historically and traditionally are excluded, I would argue that like in most instances, like larger corporations or developers are not those folks. They have a lot of channels or avenues. And so generally speaking, right, that definition of equity becomes really important in terms of how we determine like who's eligible to participate and in what ways, right? And there's a lot of ways to like manage that, but I would just say that that's like an important piece of the equation. Like that has to be a conversation with, in the PB instance, the steering committee, or more broadly, the design group.
And if I would just add something, just going back to the definitions, right, of equity and racial equity. I know that Alana has said, the group in past sessions have defined that. But, again, racial equity, defining it as like historical, like the power of institutions and systems which have created these disparities that have impacted, communities today. And create these outcomes. I think going back and naming who the actor is, who actually caused this harm, and said, hey, this harm done, and part of that process is reversing and healing and restoring, right? So this is where the proposals come in, whether it's the policy work or projects or developments come in and saying, hey, you as staff are gonna take a strong stance. And part of that work requires political champions, and requires intentional and thoughtful community engagement that's represented to help support your proposal. So I think those are a couple of pieces that I will just call out.
Thanks, Rachana. And I see that Sherry responded to a question about words and neighbor versus resident versus citizen. So you can see her answer in the chat just because we are out of time. But so one thing I will say, we have a couple other questions that we don't really have time to get to, but I do want to just reflect for a minute on what Jeremy said at the beginning of the session and the amount of questions and thoughts that everyone has in this session. So we will be having another session on engagement. And I think I just wanted to point out that one of the questions we didn't get to really talk about that's still in the chat is about establishing baseline knowledge for residents in virtual settings, because it's a lot harder to do that without some dialogue that happens in person. And I would say that I think this is something we're all learning together, right? We're in the middle of a once in a lifetime pandemic. So these conversations can continue, and that's the hope for the next session. So we will be sending out after this session our PowerPoints and Q&A and all the responses that were received, as well as long as our presenters are okay with it, their contact information. So if you have any questions, you can reach out to them, and all the resources that were talked about during the session. So the plan, as well as some of the things that Sherry mentioned. But we will also include some details about the next session, which will be a little bit more of an informal time to discuss the challenges we're all continuing to face during COVID, and how, as Sherry mentioned, right, we're probably not going back to whatever we considered to be normal before. So how do we move forward and shape our engagement practices together? So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week, and we will see you soon.